Now, we were discussing on Thursday classical realist policies, right? And the whole circle, let's say, or the whole structure that, I'm using bad words this morning, the states' aims, objectives in their foreign policy, to keep, to increase, to demonstrate power, and the possible responses that different states, different players respond to these policies. So one of the things I would like you to remember is this. Morgenthau warns us that not all policies, that is, for example, increasing one's own nuclear weapons or acquiring territory that would expand your landmass, not all actions could be seen as a policy of imperialism. Okay? They would not be, for example, Hitler's annexation of Czechoslovakia, Austria, or the declaration of war on Poland in 1939. These are all, according to classical realism, policies of imperialism. Therefore, they should be met with resistance. Okay? But unless an action changes the existing balance of power between the players, you don't necessarily actually classify that as a policy of imperialism. So within classical realism, within Morgenthau, okay, there is a very important caveat. Okay? Think of that as a very important distinction, that one of the things that foreign policy makers do is to misperceive, miscalculate the responses of their opponents, let's say, or the actions of their opponents as a policy of imperialism, where actually it's a policy of prestige, and respond with a policy of containment, which would be the wrong response. Okay? Or similarly, Morgenthau also warns us that one of the critical mistakes that happened before World War II is the adoption of a policy of appeasement towards Hitler, which actually was was one of the worst things that the British and the French could do, because it basically signaled, demonstrated to Hitler that UK and France was afraid of fighting with Germany. So the lesson is very straightforward. You can actually read the Politics Among Nations. You're Ali Özdemir, right? Bora. Okay. Who is Ali Özdemir? Okay, fine. Okay, sorry, Bora. Where was I? Appeasement. Okay. Policy of appeasement. Appeasement is trying to pacify, lessen the ambitions of a certain player. And Morgenthau, you can read, this is precisely what I was saying, you can read Morgenthau's book as a prescription, okay, to foreign policy makers. What's a prescription? Morgenthau tells the foreign policy makers of the US, Soviet Union, UK, France, what have you, to behave in a specific fashion, which is this. If you're confronted with aggressive behavior, okay, anybody, it doesn't have to be Hitler, Iran, North Korea, China, doesn't really matter who the player is. If you're confronted with a type of a behavior that would change the existing status quo, that would change the existing balance of power between you and your opponent, that should be treated as a policy of imperialism. Any change is, in that way, would be a policy of imperialism and should be contained. Okay? So if I take you back to World War II and go over what happened in 1939, what Morgenthau, classical realists, tell you is this. Hitler was following a policy that would alter the existing global balance of power, and that would basically alter the existing European balance of power. And the response that actually was formulated to deal with the Hitler's threat was, according to classical realism, the wrong response. Okay? What was the response? Do you remember? 1938 Munich Conference, okay? The policy of appeasement of Munich Conference, which was basically telling Hitler that you can do whatever you want to do with Czechoslovakia, it's okay for us, okay? So once policy of appeasement was the response coming from UK and France, according to classical realism, that opened the door towards a much, much larger war, World War II. Okay? So the response that classical realists tell you that you should always adopt when you're confronted with an alteration or a policy that would try to alter the existing power balance is a policy of containment. Okay? So after World War II, yeah, you can think of it in this fashion as well. After World War II, when we saw the Soviet Union, okay, expanding into the European territories. At the end of World War II, there was a deal that was signed between the Americans, the Brits, and the Soviets, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. They sat around a large table, and they agreed on basically a restructuring of the world in Yalta, the Yalta Agreement of 1945. And in the Yalta Agreement, what the three players actually agreed to, and this plays an important role in neorealism as well, but the three players, Soviet Union, US, and UK, decided that whichever army is the first army to enter a Nazi-occupied territory, okay? So when you look at Europe, France is under Nazi occupation. All of Central Eastern Europe is under Nazi occupation. All of Middle Europe, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands is under Nazi occupation. So whichever army comes first and frees these countries which are under Nazi occupation, they will have the interim transitional rule. So if it's the Red Army that enters, let's say, Poland first, okay, it will be the Soviet army that will basically help Poland to have this transition from Nazi occupation back to its, let's say, pre-World War II status. At the same time, in the Yalta Agreement, and that will take you to neorealism, the three major players divided the world as if it's a cake. Right? The United States got Latin America and Central America as its sphere of influence, Soviet Union, Central Eastern Europe, UK had, well, more or less Near East, right? Turkey, Greece, and Persia. Now, what happened immediately afterwards, we see from 1945 to 1949, for about 4 years, the transition of Central Eastern Europe, one after another, into Soviet orbits. Okay? Now, this, according to classical realism, is a policy of imperialism. Okay? Because once the Soviet Union begins to control Central Eastern Europe, it would basically alter the existing power balance between the US and USSR, and it would alter the existing power balance in the European continent as well. So the response to that, classical realists tell us this. If you do exactly what you have done towards Hitler, appease Hitler and tell him, okay, you can have whatever you want, you know, as long as we don't have war, it's okay for us, the Munich Conference of 38. So in 1945-49 period, the lesson of Munich, you can think of that as a lesson as well, policy of appeasement turned into, with the theoretical framework provided by classical realists, into a different type of a response. So in 1947, we actually see, just a second, Selin'cim. In 1947, we see in a journal called Foreign Affairs, a paper published by somebody named Mr. X, right? And in that paper, in 1947, Mr. X claimed that it's the American responsibility to stop Soviet expansionism, containment. Mr. X is actually George Kennan, another classical realist for you. And the Foreign Affairs article basically gave you the basic contours, the basic lines of American foreign policy after World War II, which was designed to be around the major aim of containing Soviet expansionism. Now, how do you contain Soviet expansionism? There are multiple ways of doing that. You can containment is stopping, stop its expansion. So the policy of containment is precisely what Morgenthau have told you, and it's precisely what the response that all classical realists basically agree, that if you see an attempt to change the existing status quo, the existing power balance. That's an attempt for your opponent to acquire more capabilities and promote their own interests at the expense of your own interests. So the proper response: never remain silent, don't ever appease your opponent, but always adopt a policy of containment, which is stop that increase or change in the existing power balance before it gets too late. So Kennan tells you this in 1947. He says, Soviet Union is expanding into different parts of the world, but more specifically into Central Eastern Europe. And if, for example, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia fall to Soviet rule, then there is no guarantee that Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands will not. Okay? If East Germany becomes communist, if Czechoslovakia, which is, a very central part of the European order before World War II, if they become part of the Soviet orbit, we don't know where it would end. Okay? And the containment policy designed as such states it's the American responsibility, or the American foreign policy is designed to be in such a way that it would stop Soviet expansion economically. Okay? How do you stop expansion economically? You start pumping euro dollars onto the European continent. So the Marshall Plan is adopted in 1947, okay? Which is American dollars are poured into the European continent, which is just free from world war, and it would help reconstruct Europe, build Europe back. Okay? The first actually pumping of dollars onto the European continent was done for Turkey and Greece in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, which brought American money and American military aid to these two countries, which were under Soviet threat. Marshall Plan is the second step, which is adopted for the whole of Europe. So economic. First tool that you can use in containment is you adopt economic measures that would stop Soviet expansion. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the creation of OECC, which is the predecessor of today's OECD, are the economic tools. Okay? They are the economic tools of containment. Okay? Then you would stop Soviet expansion culturally. Okay? You would build a Voice of America network, okay? Something that emphasizes free Europe, free America, free world, what have you. Okay? That's a cultural, basically, emphasis. It's a cultural war that differentiates between free and non-free. Okay? Now you have, for example, the Freedom House in the world, which basically ranks all the countries in the world based on their levels of freedom. And it has three classifications: free, non-free, and partially free. That's cultural containment. Okay? The last step, or the last measure you could actually say, in policy of containment is always military. Okay? Now, a military measure does not necessarily have to be actual war itself. The creation of an alliance, okay? Specifically in 1949, the establishment of NATO, okay? It's policy of containment. Okay? You bring together countries that feel threatened by Soviet expansion, and you build a collective defense organization, which basically all the members of NATO would be mutually committed to each other's defense if a non-NATO member, a third country, attacks them, okay? Stages some kind of an attack. That's military, okay? That's the establishment of a defense organization is a military measure or a military tool that would go under policy of containment. So post-World War II period, exactly like classical realists have told you. Okay? This is how your theory would become, basically foreign policy on the ground. Because most of the IR theories, why do we use them? We also use them to establish specific policies on the ground. Okay? So the classical realist theory leads you to, as a foreign policy tool, the adoption of containment in 1947, which is designed to stop Soviet expansion, specifically in the 1940s. Okay? So anything that happens during World War II, from during the Cold War, from 1945 to 1989, anything that happens during the Cold War years, you could actually analyze them through the lenses provided by the classical realist with the emphasis of the policy of containment. Okay? So Soviet Union, what is it trying to do in 1945? It's trying to alter the existing status quo between itself and the USA. How is Soviet Union doing that? It's taking over the control of Central Eastern Europe, and it's acquiring significant capabilities, nuclear capabilities to be specific, that would make it more powerful compared to, let's say, the US. How does the US respond? Okay? If the US responded with a policy of appeasement, like UK and France did to Hitler, classical realists tell you that this would bring World War III. Okay? So instead of policy of appeasement, the US response has to be formulated around containment. Okay? How do you contain an aggressive, expansionist, imperialistic in that sense, power? Multiple ways: economic, cultural, political, military. Does it mean that containment would eventually take you to war? Probably yes. Okay? That it might eventually lead to an actual war, but the critical matter is Soviet Union is perceived to be an expanding, aggressive, imperialistic power, and the response adopted by the US and Western Europe is a policy of containment. So all of the Cold War years, from 45 to 89, is basically guided or more or less managed through these lenses of containment. Okay? So this is the reason why I mentioned, let's say, the Cuban Missile Crisis on Thursday in 1962, okay? When the American intelligence discovered the presence of missiles or missile activity in Cuba, okay, Soviet missiles. This was immediately perceived as a policy of imperialism. Why? Cuba is very close to the American landmass. If you have missiles in Cuba, you can hit Miami in 2 seconds, you can hit Washington, what have you. So once the Soviet Union has an arsenal, okay, some form of a base in a territory very close to the US, that would alter the balance of nuclear, let's say, it would alter the nuclear balance between the US and USSR. So from an American point of view, the Soviet presence in Cuba was a policy of imperialism. Okay? So how do you respond? Do you basically appease the Soviets and say, well, Cuba is a very nice little island, stay there as much as you want? Or do you, basically adopt a policy of containment? If you do appeasement from classical realist perspective, okay, Soviet Union will acquire the capability to threaten the American soil, doesn't even have to use them. The presence of nuclear missiles very close to your landmass in and of itself is a very significant capability. The threat itself is sufficient. So the US has to reverse that action. Right? What would be the possible alternatives to do that? How would you reverse the Soviet presence in Cuba? Okay, multiple tools, again, under containment. You can build an economic embargo around Cuba. Well, an embargo already is on Cuba since 1958, Batista, the Castro Revolution, which basically overthrew Batista. You can declare war on the Soviet Union and find yourself fighting a nuclear war. You can do limited airstrikes. These are all tools that you can use under containment, or you can do a naval blockade. So the crux of the matter is not what tool was finally chosen, but the main importance, the most important thing you have to think about is that once the US confronted imperialistic action from classical realist point of view from the Soviet Union, it had to stop this. Okay? Same thing, 1980s. Okay? Iran and Iraq are developing significant capabilities, nuclear, chemical, biological. Okay? If Iran and Iraq, okay, on their own, as separate countries, acquire these nuclear, chemical, biological capabilities, they would then alter the Middle East balance of power, and at the same time, once they alter the Middle East balance of power, it would change the global balance of power. So what does the United States government do? In the 1980s, it now adopts a dual containment policy on Iran and Iraq. Okay? 2007, 2008 onwards, similar situation. Iran is building nuclear capabilities. It's perceived to be a change in the existing power balance. So what does the US and the European allies within NATO, except Turkey, do? They adopt another policy of containment towards Iran. They enact economic sanctions on Iran. They try to adopt UN Security Council resolutions with the possibility of a use of force in the future to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. These are all tools of what? Containment. These are all tools of containment. Okay? So the classical realist vision is very straightforward. Okay? There is an existing power balance between different players at any given period of time. Okay? And if one of the players try to alter that power balance by acquiring new capabilities or by adopting certain policies that would be detrimental to the security interests of the other player, okay, they would be classified as a policy of imperialism, which is an increase in their power. So the proper response to that would be always to stop as much as possible that increase in power. Is it always possible? No. Okay? But the policy of containment is the proper response to policy of imperialism. This in return takes us to this point. According to classical realism, you might be confronted with actually a policy of imperialism. Okay? You might actually see an expansion of power in your opponent, but if you misperceive that policy and think, this is a policy of prestige, policy of, what was the other one, status quo, then you don't do anything. You might find yourself in a much worse, unstable position in the future if you don't perceive or if you don't, correctly identify what is looking into your face. So when, for example, Soviet Union is putting Cuba, missiles in Cuba, and if you think this is not a policy of imperialism, but it's only a demonstration of Soviet power, you would then most likely face nuclear war or increased Soviet power in your own territory. Okay? So the proper response is always a policy of containment, but before you can adopt the policy of containment, you also have to correctly identify the action that's confronting you in your face, whether it's a keep, demonstrate, or increase power. Selin and Jamal, you had a question. You forgot your question because I talked so much.
You said that prior to World War II, like UK and France adopted the appeasement policy, but couldn't their motive be like gaining enough time to build up their armies and like be ready for a possible world war? Like it's not a misperception, but a measure.
No, that's a good question. What you're saying is if the Brits and the French did allow Hitler to absorb Czechoslovakia, wouldn't it be something to buy them time? Yes and no, in the sense that because UK and France actually thought that they would be stopping a possible war if Hitler was allowed to have a free hand in Czechoslovakia. So they actually thought that, then this also became an important lesson in international politics, which we call the lesson of Munich, that once you say yes to an aggressive player, it will confront you further with a further demand in the longer term. Okay? So the lesson of Munich, for example, became critical in the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, that if you appease an aggressive power, in that case North Vietnam in 1965, it would lead to a much higher demand coming from Vietnam in Indochina. So the lesson of Munich, okay, it's an important lesson again in classical realism as well, if you're confronted with aggressive behavior, don't give in, basically. That's the lesson of meaning, okay? If, you know, and this is exactly what's happening currently as well in world politics. If somebody plays, you know, an aggressive hand towards you, and if you give in, it will make it much worse in the longer run, because it could actually eventually lead to war, which you could have prevented if you stand firm in the first place, okay? Jamal?
What Iran is doing is the policy of containment. Israel is already a nuclear power.
Yes.
It's not a non-signatory to the NPT.
Right.
And, with this, it's unfair in the Middle East. So maybe they're just trying to level the balance. And then
Yeah, you're right. So you can say, if you are, if you're looking at it from the other point of view, you could say that Iran is actually now following a policy of containment towards Israeli policy of imperialism. Of course. Yeah. It's just, these are not only, the policies that we're talking about are not for the US or the West only. Okay? It applies to all states in the world, because classical realism applies to all. So if you want to understand, for example, why Iran is building nuclear capabilities, precisely classical realism tells you why. Through the balancing act of the Israeli power. Okay? Same thing. Why would Pakistan develop nuclear weapons in the 1990s? Huh? India already has them, exactly. So unless Pakistan responds to India's increase in power with its own capabilities, Pakistan will be in a position where India could demand anything from Pakistan, and Pakistan cannot stop this. The whole logic revolves around the logic of deterrence, okay? And it's deterrence that classical realists use to explain why certain actors act the way they do. Now, so let's just stop for a second and talk about deterrence. Nuclear weapons, they are tools of deterrence, okay? Economic sanctions, tools of deterrence as well. So deterrence and containment, you can visualize them together in the same basket. The reason why Pakistan developed nuclear weapons was to increase its own power vis-a-vis India, which already had nuclear weapons, but also by doing so, by acquiring nuclear capability, Pakistan was trying to stop an act of violence, aggression from India in the first place, okay? So deterrence, okay, is, again, very straightforward, okay? You try to stop an action before it occurs. Right? So the logic of deterrence is this. Since the world is composed of states which basically live in a world where there is no central authority, which was actually one of the questions I asked in the midterm, the states have to rely on their own power to survive. Okay? Anarchy leads to self-help. Okay? Now, in that fashion, in an anarchical world, states basically expect other states to use different tools, one of which is use of force, to get what they want from them. Okay? So Pakistan fears India might use force to get, I don't know, Kashmir. Okay? Or Pakistan fears India might use force to get what, for example, Jamal? Exactly. So water conflict, scarcity of resource. Okay? Iran fears that Iraq in the 1980s would acquire certain lands that they are, in the border between Iran and India, Iran and Iraq, so that Iraqi power would increase. Okay? Israel fears that all the Arab states that surround Israel might someday attack Israel together in the future, as it happened in 1948, 56, 67, 73, 4 Arab-Israeli wars. Okay? So you try to prevent something before it occurs. Okay? You don't, of course, constantly live in fear somebody's going to attack you, but in an anarchical world, which separates it from domestic politics, there is always the possibility of war, attack, aggression, what have you. It doesn't even have to be war. Okay? So what do? You want to prevent something before it occurs. The only way to do that passes through increasing your own capabilities so that you would demonstrate to the other side, and this is the basis in nuclear weapons, to the other side, your possible opponent, that they have more to lose than potential benefits from attacking you. Okay? Rationality assumption takes you back to our starting rationality assumption. So you try to demonstrate, if you're Pakistan, to India, that India has potentially material costs that would exceed the material benefits that it might incur if it attacks Pakistan. Okay? Similarly, you make it obvious to Iran that it would have a much higher material cost if it builds nuclear weapons than its potential material benefits. So it doesn't even have to be war. You try to stop other players from acquiring nuclear weapons. So deterrence is to stop something before it occurs. Okay? The way to do that passes through utility calculations. Okay? You demonstrate, basically, or you make it obvious that material costs of a certain action exceed material benefits of a certain action. Okay? So, perfect example, 1945. Okay? Turkey is sitting happily in its own geographical landmass, and there is a message coming from good old Khrushchev. Okay? What mistake did I make? Yes. Okay. So what was I supposed to say? Stalin. Okay. So Stalin is in Moscow and sends a message to the Turkish government and says, well, you remember the agreement we signed at the end of World War I, which is for friendship and non-aggression between Turkey and the Soviet Union. Okay? And that agreement which we signed was signed in 1925. It has, an expiration date. It's about to expire in 1945. If Turkey still wants to have a non-aggression and good neighborliness agreement with the Soviet Union, well, the Soviet Union has some conditions. Okay? We would like to have, Stalin says, certain territories. We really love Kars and Ardahan, okay? But they are part of Turkey. So would you consider giving Kars and Ardahan to us? Then Stalin says, and we are a country which is locked in the cold seas, and we have been dreaming since Peter the Great to have access to the warm seas. But alas, the Turkish straits are under the control of the Turkish government. So if you want to have a non-aggression friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, to the Turkish government, would you consider giving some basis and some control to the Soviet Union on the Turkish straits? Huh? So İnönü, sitting in his palace in Ankara, finds himself confronted with Soviet demands. Okay? Kars and Ardahan, Turkish straits, in lieu for the renegotiating and re-signing of the Non-Aggression Pact of 1925 with the Soviet Union. Okay? So this is a direct threat. Okay? But Soviet Union is not telling İnönü that we are going to attack you. Okay? So there is no opening of war yet. There is no war in the horizon, but there is the possibility of war. Okay? And if you're in İnönü, you look around and you see, well, Stalin and Soviet Union has come out of World War II, along with the USA as one of the key superpowers, and they are actually transforming Central Eastern Europe. So is the threat threatable? Is the threat credible? Is the threat credible? Yes, it's a credible threat. So it's not like Zambia turning to Turkey and give me Kars and Ardahan. Huh? When it comes from a powerful state such as the Soviet Union, it has credibility. Now, how would the Turkish government stop Soviet Union from acquiring these lands? And how would the Turkish government, in the possibility of a future Soviet attack, prevent that? That is, bottom line, how would Turkey deter Soviet Union from making demands on Turkey, and how would the Turkish government stop Soviet Union from attacking Turkey in the future? Okay? 1945, what would be the possible tools that you can use to deter the Soviet Union? Well, yeah, you would go for an alliance, but there is also, you could actually try to first rely on your own resources, okay? Is it possible for Turkey to acquire, let's say, nuclear weapons in 1945, so it would stop Soviet Union, like Pakistan did towards India, to stop Soviet Union making such demands, okay? No, okay? So one possible route, which is to increase your own capabilities through boosting of your own armaments, okay, nuclear, conventional, what have you, through your own military capabilities is not possible because of the existing economic and military situation in Turkey in 1945. So you go for route number 2, which is what Jamal had said, find a powerful friend, okay, ally with others who see the Soviet Union as a threat, and through that alliance, demonstrate, signal, okay, demonstrated to the Soviet Union that they have more to lose than potential gain from threatening Turkey. Okay? So through an alliance, Turkey increases the costs of a threat to the Soviet Union, and it increases the possible cost of an attack towards the Soviet Union. Okay? It doesn't mean it would prevent the attack. Okay? But once the threats and attacks cease, once they stop, okay, you can then say, okay, the actions I have taken, entering an alliance with the Western Europeans and the United States, have stopped Soviet Union from attacking me. Okay? So when you're faced with a threat, you use two possible routes, your own armaments and a possible alliance, to increase basically the material costs to the other player that they would reap from attacking you, threatening you, what have you. Okay? But there is a catch. Okay? What do you think is the catch? Is there a loophole here? Well, that will come later, but you know, is there another loophole in this argument? Is there a possible weakness in this argument? Selin, you were saying? Okay, the possible weakness, loophole is this. You operate from the starting assumption that your opponent, the other player, what have you, is planning to attack you. Okay? So you basically build a strategy, deterrence plan, based on an a priori belief, a belief that exists beforehand. Okay? You think, you calculate that you will be faced with an attack. What if the other player has no intention to attack you? Okay? What if you're operating on a faulty assumption? What if the Soviet Union is just using empty threats, and in the final round they would not stop, they would not attack you? What if Pakistan is operating on an a priori belief that India is planning to attack it while India doesn't have any plan? Can we verify the possibility of an attack before it occurs? And can we verify that our measures, the deterrent tools that we have taken, stop the attack that hasn't taken place in the first place? Okay? So that's the possible loophole. Deterrence is about stopping something before it occurs. Okay? There is no way to verify whether that thing was going to happen anyway. Okay? But once it doesn't happen, you then conclude, okay, Soviet Union did not attack Turkey because of the deterrent measures Turkey took, entering into a NATO alliance or allying with the USA. Okay? We don't know. You cannot verify whether deterrence actually works, right? 100%. You can only verify if an attack occurs and then you reverse it. That's the only way you can actually verify something. You can only verify when deterrence does not work. Okay? You can only be sure that somebody was planning to attack you and the tools you have adopted to stop that did not work when the actual attack occurs. Okay? So you only know when deterrence fails. Okay? You can never know 100% whether deterrence works. Okay? Because you operate on the assumption that your opponent is planning to attack you. What if it's just your hüsnü kuruntu? Okay? How do you translate üstün kuruntu? What if it's only, you know, an empty guess on your part? Okay? Now, but then, according to classical realism, the risk is too great if you don't assume it. Right? The risk is too great if you don't assume a potential act of aggression from your players, precisely because of the ordering principle of the world, that's anarchy. Okay? So deterrence is a subject, or deterrence is this concept that we use in realism to understand why states build armaments, okay? Why states build nuclear weapons, okay? Why states enter into alliances, okay? All alliance formation is about deterrence, okay? Especially the smaller states, okay? Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Turkey in the 1940s, they need alliances in order to stop possible attacks on them. Okay? What India and Pakistan is doing, okay? Both have more or less equal nuclear capabilities. Therefore, and this is the whole essence of deterrence as well, therefore, both India and Pakistan have this knowledge. Okay? India knows if it attacks Pakistan with nuclear weapons, Pakistan will respond back. Okay? And it will mean, if India uses nuclear weapons, it might mean the destruction of Pakistan, but it will also mean the destruction of India. Okay? Pakistan has the same knowledge. Once both sides know that they each have the nuclear capability, then both sides also know that neither will attack the other, because it could easily escalate into nuclear war, and that would prevent the possibility of war, that would prevent actually the actual use of force between the two, even though the conflicts of interest. What was the name of the river?
Well, in India, it's Ganges for us.
Okay, so that river, the territory of Kashmir, okay, whatever is a source of friction between India and Pakistan cannot lead to war now, because both parties have the nuclear deterrent, okay? Which means then the potential material costs of using nuclear weapons exceed the potential material benefits of nuclear weapons. Therefore, they become, what do they become? They become non-usable, okay? They become non-usable. Once either side acquires the possibility of winning a nuclear war, then they would become usable, okay? And that's actually the nuclear strategy that characterizes the Cold War years. So nuclear capabilities are then tools of deterrence, precisely. The nuclear deterrent, that's the word, okay? Same thing. NATO has nuclear capabilities, okay? NATO's strategy in the Cold War years rested upon the nuclear presence of the US on the European soil, okay? So we had nuclear weapons in Germany, okay? Or nuclear bases in Germany. So Soviet Union knew that if it planned to attack European territory, or NATO's European territory, it will have to deal with nuclear weapons. So even if Soviet Union has the desire to attack, it would not, because the costs of attack exceed the possible material benefits of an attack, okay? So, but they all come back to the same point, okay? We are assuming there is an intent to attack, that there is an intent to use force, but not to assume that, according to classical realism, would be too risky for states. It would lead to their total annihilation in the future if they don't actually assume that everybody that surrounds them plans to attack them. Okay? Fine. So the classical realist vision then, okay, gives you the concepts of deterrence, gives you a policy of appeasement, gives you the idea of containment, and you could actually basically evaluate all state actions. Okay? What the Turkish government tried to do in 1945 was to contain Soviet expansion into Turkey, and they did that through an alliance with the United States. Similarly, the United States wanted to stop Soviet expansion into Greece, Turkey, Western Europe, what have you, and they have used certain tools. Truman Doctrine for Turkey and Greece, which is pumping off military and financial aid to these two countries. Marshall Plan for all of Europe, okay, which is pumping of dollars onto the European continent. So they would actually, rebuild themselves and become relatively strong vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And NATO, the creation of NATO in 1949, is the final, or the peak, let's say, of the containment policy, where you adopt a structure which builds on a nuclear deterrent and the logic of collective defense, that an attack against one is an attack against all, and it would be met collectively by all the members of NATO, is precisely that deterrent logic. Okay? You demonstrate to your potential aggressor, Soviet Union in this case, because NATO was created against Soviet Union, that they have more to lose from their potential attack than any possible gain. So all alliances are based on deterrence. Okay? To come back to containment policy for a second in the USA, the American foreign policy in the Cold War years revolves around both the containment policy and something that comes together with that, which is called the domino theory. Okay? So the US foreign policy from 1945 to 1989 visualized the states in the world as if they are dominoes. Okay? And the last domino is actually the United States. And if you think of dominoes, they're all next to one another. And once dominoes start falling to communism, okay? Central Eastern Europe, but then Indochina in the 1960s. So that's the reason why we have the war in Vietnam. All of these dominoes, once one falls into communism, the next one would fall, one after another. Eventually, the last domino to fall would be the United States. Okay? So the domino theory basically came with a vision that it's the American and the Western European responsibility together with that to stop states falling into communism. Okay? China was perceived to be a domino that fall into communism in 1949. The Chinese transition to communism triggered what was happening in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all of these areas. Any change in Latin America, okay, if you have in Latin America, in Chile, Nicaragua, Guatemala, any change towards some form of socialist government, doesn't have to be communist, okay? Social democratic governments, they were perceived by the United States within the foreign policy lenses of containment and domino theory. So if you have a democratically elected, let's say, social democratic government in Chile, okay, that was a threat to the Cold War balances in 1971, okay? So it would be overthrown by a support. It will be overthrown by a right-wing dictatorship. So all of the changes in Latin America politically that happened in the 60s, 70s, until mid-1980s was an outcome of the Cold War dynamics. Okay? So I'll give you a break and we continue. Fine. Now, where were we? We were talking about the the starting assumption in deterrence, and then the possibility of verifying deterrence. Okay, so Alican. So of course.
How can we differentiate the policies as it is containment or imperialist policy? For example, China is developing relations with African countries. Is it to contain U.S. expansion, or is it an imperialist?
Very good. There's a very good answer to that, or there's a very simple answer to that. Okay, could any one of you answer, Alican? From Chinese perspective, the American action and presence in Africa, is it imperialism, containment? Exactly. From an American perspective, what China is doing is imperialistic. So it depends, precisely, it depends on where you're looking at it. So, and these are all binary relations. So from Soviet perspective, okay, what the United States was doing in Cuba, in Europe, in the 1940s, 50s, is imperialistic. What the Soviet Union is doing is containment. From an American perspective, what the Soviet Union is doing is imperialistic, and what the United States is doing is containment. Okay? Similarly, Iran, Israel, Israel sees Iran imperialistic. Israel sees, which one did I say? Iran sees Israel imperialistic, okay? So it depends on where you're looking at it.
Nobody says that I am imperialist and I am...
No, of course not. Of course not. So nobody will tell you that, I'm the one who's trying to change the existing power balance and therefore I'm following imperialistic positions. So the labels that you could do, the labels are not that important anyway, okay? So what matters in classical realism is when you have two players, okay, more than one player at any given period of time, two players, one of them will be, not all of them will do that, but one of them will try to change the existing power balance, the other will try to stop that. But you will also have a lot of players that are, status quo players, okay? Canada, Norway, Sweden, these are status quo players. They don't want to change the existing power balance at all. So not all players follow constantly imperialistic positions or an attempt to change the existing power balance. So the shortest answer to your question is if you're looking at a dyad, two players who are following a specific policy, they will use different labels for the other one depending upon their position. So China will see itself as the container. The US will see itself as the container, okay, over the same area. Jamal?
Realism is a very backward and barbaric method to look at this.
You could use the word pessimistic, right? That's
I prefer barbaric.
barbaric.
Thinking about war and politics and power. I mean,
Well, a lot of people classify realism as a very pessimistic theory, okay? But yeah, in that sense, and I can understand why you're seeing it as a barbaric theory, but what you mean is it deduces human behavior, it deduces human behavior to a very, selfish nature, okay? Yes. Okay? Because that's its starting assumption. Okay? Now think of Thomas Hobbes. Okay? You already had Hobbes. You discussed Hobbes. Now, when you think of the environment within which Thomas Hobbes is living, when is he writing the Leviathan? Do you remember?
17th century.
Exactly. 1648, during the British Civil War. Okay? So Hobbes personally sees the destruction of the order that the British monarchy symbolized, okay? And he sees Cromwellian politics. He sees the execution of Charles I, and he sees the transition in Britain, okay? So he is able to actually directly relate to, from his own personal experience, he's able to deduce certain assumptions about human nature because he lives in a world where all central authority has collapsed. So it's no coincidence that Hobbes tells you that state of nature is state of war. Okay? It's no coincidence that Hobbes tells you that human nature is not improvable, and in the absence of an overarching authority, i.e. the Leviathan, okay, human beings will basically be slaughtering one another, that man is wolf to another man. Okay? So it's Hobbes's personal experience during the collapse in the British order in 1648, which forms the very basis of his theory. Okay? Therefore, yes, the starting assumptions are, once the starting assumptions are quote-unquote pessimistic, the theories that build on top of them in return become, in Jamal's word, barbaric, but more, utility maximizer, let's say. Okay? Same thing when you think about Thucydides. Okay? And when is Thucydides writing? The Melian dialogue that you have read. Okay, there is a very strong message in the Melian dialogue. Okay, the strong will survive no matter what, and the weak will just suffer whatever it must. Okay, that's actually a very, very pessimistic view of the world, where the weak is not protected by anybody. Okay, the weak will just suffer. Now, when is Thucydides writing? The Peloponnesian Wars. Okay, so he's an historian. Well, he's actually Athenian general turned historian, and he's recording the Peloponnesian War. So he's able to see with his own eyes what human beings do to one another. Okay, and again, I don't want to depress or upset you, but we know what happens in every society when you remove the central authority. Okay, when you remove the tools with which you can actually guide human behavior, human beings revert back to violence most often, okay? And there is this as a theme, of course, is very strong in international relations because of the realist paradigm, but it's also a fact of human life, okay? And that's also the reason why, and you'll see this again next week, that we actually see the liberal challenge towards realism saying, well, the assumptions of realism are actually faulty, and human nature is not unimprovable, but it could be improved, and there would be conditions under which, let's say, cooperation is more likely than conflict, okay? So people who think like Cemal would not agree with the realist theory and challenge realism through the liberal paradigm, let's say, okay? Fine. But nonetheless, this has been the dominant theory in international relations, at least for the better half of the 20th century. And it has been, you know, the challenges to that came only towards the end of the 70s, early 1980s, okay? Fine. So, neorealism. If classical realism, okay, gives you the state-to-state behavior, okay, and the basic concepts of power, interest, rationality assumption, state-centric world, unitary, they all come from classical realism. What is neorealism telling us, okay? So if I, for example, ask you to compare classical and neorealism, okay, you will be able to basically tell me the common points between them, okay? Both, well, they are under the realist paradigm, of course. Both are state-centric, so states are the main units of analysis. Both rest on the rationality assumption. They're all under the same paradigm, of course. They both talk about the unitariness of the state actor, discount the role that sub-state actors might play, different groups that make up the state. They also discount the role that supranational actors, that is, the actors that are above the state, such as the IMF, EU, NATO, what have you, play. But what is it that we have in neorealism that changes or that adds, let's say, on top of classical realism? Now, we already now know the names associated with classical realism, right? When I say classical realism, you're able to tell me it's Hans Morgenthau, okay? It's E.H. Carr to a certain extent. George Kennan, okay? Classical realism, which is what we just gone over. When I say neorealism, the name that should pop up immediately in your brains is Kenneth Waltz, okay? So Waltz. And Kenneth Waltz, we talked about Kenneth Waltz when we did a little bit science of IR. Kenneth Waltz, in 1959, okay, published his PhD dissertation, actually, is a book, and it's titled Man, State, and War, right? Which you are reading portions of under Explaining War. And there, Kenneth Waltz made a very important differentiation, which we use in almost all theories of international relations, and that's between different types of theories. Kenneth Waltz told us that you can divide theories of international relations into two different groups: the reductionist theories and systemic theories. The reductionist theories look at unit level factors, okay? What's a unit level factor? We have done this when we looked into levels of analysis. It's the individuals that make the foreign policy in a state. That's a unit level factor. Or the attributes that the state has, whether, you know, what kind of a geography it has, that's an attribute. What kind of a political system, whether it's a democracy or a non-democracy, that's an attribute. What kind of distribution of power, whether it's a presidential or parliamentary system, okay? Attributes that belong to that specific unit, okay? Kenneth Waltz defines all of them under the larger umbrella of reductionist theories, okay? And he argues that reductionist theories, i.e. first and second level, they try to explain what happens internationally through national level factors, okay? Now, these would be basically the first and second image, i.e. what you have learned so far as individual and state level analysis. In the first image of IR, you basically look at, and I just wrote source of conflict, but you can also say cooperation, doesn't really matter. It's in man's nature. In the second image, it's in the internal organization of states, democracy or not, that's internal organization. Whereas Kenneth Walsh says, if you want to actually have a comprehensive analysis of international outcomes, interstate behavior, you have to look at the system, the international system. So reductionism and systemic is the differentiation that Walsh gives us in 1959. And reductionism or reductionist theories, by definition, give you an incomplete, not false, but an incomplete picture of international outcomes. Okay? It's an incomplete and inadequate. If it's incomplete, therefore it's not adequate, an inadequate picture of international relations. And a comprehensive, look, a comprehensive analysis could only be possible if you look at the larger structure, okay, the international system. So you need to explain basically outcomes through the interactions between the actors and through the ordering principle of the system. And I'll explain what that ordering principle is. So Man, State, and War, okay? Walsh's first book gives you 3 different images of IR, first, second, and third. Let me go over them again quickly because we need to look at it, but you already know it. In the first image, okay, who the leader is makes a difference. Okay? So you could say Obama or Romney, whoever is elected. If you're a first image IR theoretician, you will think that American foreign policy will change depending on who is in charge of the American government. Okay? Or you could also say, doesn't have to be who the person actually is in charge of is the key. You could also say in the first image theories, you can also basically argue that the human nature, okay? Human beings are by definition, what Jamal have already contested, aggressive. Okay? So you can say human nature is a psychological component. Precisely because it's prone to aggression, war is always likely between states. So cause of war lies in the people and their nature is the critical element. Okay? So you can never eliminate war as long as you have human beings in the world, because human beings by definition are aggressive. Okay? Or again, in the first image theories, a lot of people argue that it's the biological differences between man and woman who basically is in power shapes the final outcome. So man, by definition, biologically is more prone to conflict-ridden behavior. As long as man controls international politics, wars are more likely. Okay? But if women replace men and it's women who make foreign policy, then war might no longer be that much in the options. Okay? So that's a biological differentiation. Okay? It still is first image because it looks at something about the human beings. Okay? But the source of conflict lies in the type of entities that human beings are. Okay? So gender-based differences. As long as men are in power, biologically, war is an end result. Okay? So you could eliminate war by eliminating exactly, by eliminating man. But it's still a first image. Second image, tell me about the second image. You know this now.
States are the determinant factors. States seek their own power, and use power to actually, maintain their position.
Okay, to promote their interests. Okay, so Bouquet says in the second image theory, you look at the state. Okay? state-level analysis. And she says you can look at the power distribution between states, and through the power distribution between states, you can build a theory on foreign policy behavior. Okay? What could be another type of a second image theory?
Something like the democratic peace theory?
Exactly. Very good. Okay? So democratic peace theory is a second image theory where you say democracies rarely fight with one another because democracies have specific tools of conflict resolution internally, which then they project to their external relations with other states. Okay? So in the democratic peace theory, okay, you find cause of war in the political attributes of the state. Okay? Second image. You can also say that domestic bargaining between different groups that make up of the state. Okay? Oh, my voice is gone. Domestic bargaining. Okay? You can say states are composed of multiple social political groups. All of these social political groups have diverging preferences. Okay? Let's say the landowners in the US don't necessarily have the same preference with the trade unions in the US. Okay? So social political groups, multiple, and all of these have different preferences, and foreign policy of a state is shaped by domestic bargaining between these different social groups, and whichever group is relatively more powerful is able to get its own preference reflected as foreign policy. Okay? That's a second image theory. Okay? Why? You look at the state, you look at what happens within the state, what kind of bargaining takes place between the state institutions or the groups that make up the state. This is actually called the liberal theory of IR. That's a second image theory, okay? Because you try to understand, let's say, American foreign policy by looking at domestic social groups in the United States. You try to understand Pakistani foreign policy by looking at multiple groups and whoever is more powerful within Pakistan to see what kind of a policy that they would, let's say, follow towards India, okay? So anything you look within the state, it could be, as Alican has said, the type of the political regime, democracy, non-democracy, okay? It could be, as Bouquet said, the type of capabilities that a state possesses, okay? The second image level. It could be, as I have given you the example, domestic bargaining within the state between multiple different groups, okay? Bouquet's theory is classical realism. Alican's theory is democratic peace. My theory is liberal theory of IR. Okay? All explain foreign policy behavior through something about the state. Bouquet, power; Alican, democracy; Meltem, domestic bargaining. Okay? Something about the state, an attribute about the state, explains the state's foreign policy. That's second image. Okay? You take something about the state and you conclude the foreign policy behavior. Okay? Iran declares, let's say, war on Iraq, 1981. Okay? Second image theory will look at Iranian's specific political regime if it's democratic peace. Okay? Second image theory, it will look at Iranian power vis-a-vis Iraq, Bouquet's classical realism. Okay? Liberal theory of IR, my theory, I would look at domestic bargaining within Iran and whichever group is more powerful who wants to declare war against Iraq, liberal theory of IR. Okay? But all of these explain the Iranian decision to go to war with Iraq in 1981 linked to something about the Iranian state: democracy, power, domestic bargaining. All three different theories, okay? And these two theories that come from Alican and Meltem is from the liberal paradigm. The theory that comes from Bouquet is from the realist paradigm. So the level does not necessarily correspond to the type of the paradigm that you're using, okay? But it basically analyzes foreign policy behavior by looking at something, okay, about the state. Therefore, the common point between these three different theories is what? Is their level, exactly, okay? Now, so Waltz says this is reductionism, okay? You cannot understand foreign policy behavior of Iran by only looking at something about Iran, okay? There has to be more beyond the specificities of the Iranian state or the American state or what have you. So you need to look at the whole picture, which Waltz says is the international system itself. So third image, the reason why Iran, according to Kenneth Waltz, decides to go to war with Iraq in 1981 is nothing related to allegiance, democracy. So Iran might go to war if it was a democracy as well, or it has nothing to do with the Iranian power calculations exactly at that period of time, as Bouquet have said, or it is nothing to do with domestic bargaining within the Iranian state, as Meltem have said. Okay? Kenneth Waltz says the cause lies in the international environment. Okay? What is it about the international environment then we have to look at? Okay? So the first two images, of course, Kenneth Waltz doesn't say they don't exist. Huh? They still play a role. Okay? And you could actually think of these in two different ways. Okay? In one different way. Waltz differentiates, exactly like different theories, he differentiates between the causes of international behavior, permissive and expressive. The main cause of all international behavior is the international system. That's the permissive layer, okay? It's the permissive cause. Wars happen because there is nothing to prevent them. Okay? That's the permissive cause. But then, if wars happen because there is nothing to prevent them, you'll have to see constant warfare all throughout the world, non-stop. That's not the case. Okay? We don't constantly see war. Okay? India and Pakistan doesn't constantly fight. Iran and Iraq doesn't constantly fight. So if wars happen because there is nothing to prevent them, what could be the exact situations under which wars actually erupt? Okay? So wars happen because there is nothing to prevent them is the permissive cause. Okay? They happen because there is no central authority. Okay? It's an anarchical world. Okay? But then, based on that permissive level, there has to be some expressive, some final, let's say, factors that makes India and Pakistan fight a war in, when was the last time you fought? 2007. And Iran and Iraq to fight in 1981, but not in, let's say, 2012. Okay? So what is the permissive and the expressive cause relationship? Lies, it plays a very important role in Kenneth Waltz. To make life simple for you, Waltz tells you a proper analysis of international politics requires a look at the system within which states interact with one another. Okay? But that's only the permissive cause. Okay? To assess the conditions under which certain types of behavior occurs, you have to look at the expressive causes. So first and second, reductionist level is your expressive factors. The third level, systemic theories, it's your permissive level. But there is also a key difference between what Waltz say and Morgenthau says. Okay? In the previous hour, when we discussed what Morgenthau is saying, okay, Morgenthau is telling you that, yes, the United States would adopt a policy of containment if it's facing a policy of imperialism. Okay? Now, in that argument, there is actually an element of what we call voluntarism. Okay? So Waltz, did I say Waltz? Morgenthau and Cannon emphasize in their theories here this whole containment and deterrence. They become voluntary actions by states. So classical realists tell you that when states balance one another, create a specific balance of power, it's actually a decision they make voluntarily. Okay? It's not something that emerges beyond their individual decision-making capacities. Walt challenges that. Did I say Walt? Waltz and Walt. There is also a Walt, Stefan Walt, in neorealism. They challenge that. They basically argue that the voluntary actions that classical realists talk about are not voluntary. Okay? They are actually determined by the international system within which these states try to survive. Okay? So a very important differentiation that neorealists bring into the classical realist vision is the contestation of the voluntary actions of states. States don't choose to go into an alliance, as classical realists claim to. Walt say they have no choice. Right? That the element of freedom to choose that classical realists emphasize, neorealists say doesn't exist. Okay? That states don't choose entering an alliance. They enter an alliance precisely because they have to. Alliances form as a result of a systemic tendency. So Waltz differentiates between voluntary action and deterministic action. And according to Waltz, states, with a very few exceptions, of course, don't have a freedom of mobility, okay, which classical realists explain them to have. Why do you think this is the case? I'm giving you the answer. Why don't states have a choice in neorealism? Okay.
There's only maybe one question thinking in terms of the position of a state or its benefit. So it's not the case that the governor or the
Foreign policy maker.
decides something. He must or she must decide that thing for his benefit.
Okay, good. I know where you're going to. Any other tries?
What do you mean by mobility of power? By mobility of a country?
Did I use the word mobility?
Yeah, that's what it's on.
I used the word mobility? Are you sure?
We have it on tape.
Don't have the mobility,
Freedom of choice, I meant. Okay, sorry, wrong word. Freedom of choice. Now, Waltz tells you that the international system could be analyzed through specifically through the distribution of power that exists at any given period of time. Okay? So freedom of mobility is from yesterday's lecture, değil mi Hazal? Okay, freedom of choice. So distribution of power is what neorealists look at. And they say that at any given period of time, when you look at the international system at any given period of time, you will see a specific type of a distribution of power. Okay? What does this mean? The way that different states have, and this is coming directly from classical realists, of course, the way that different states have different capabilities, okay? Military, economic, political, geographic, what have you, okay, is distributed in such a way that you could actually define the international system through the concentration of power. More specifically, Waltz says you could actually have, let me write it here, an international spectrum of power. And the international spectrum of power gives you where each and every state is located. Okay? At the very top of the ladder, at the highest level, at the very top of the ladder, what do you think you have? What kind of states do you think we would have? Huh? Okay, fine. We would have the superpowers. And Alican said the hegemonic leader or hegemons. You could also use that word, okay? But hegemonic leadership is contested a little bit, so I'll come to that. So superpowers, okay? What would you have at the very other end? Huh? Developing, well, it depends. You cannot, developing is another different matter. Third world, weak states. You would have the weak states. Now, if you want to have your world differentiation, okay, we could also do that. You would have the first world, and these are, of course, not fixed. They would change. Somebody said third world. We have 5 worlds now, okay? Fifth world is bottom of the barrel, okay? Who do you think would go for? Huh? Exactly, okay? Or you could say Ethiopia, Somalia. Now, these are also the weak states, okay? Now, this first to fifth world differentiation, of course, is based on levels of economic development, okay? So the first world is the industrial developed world, and the fifth world is the least developed, mainly agricultural, extremely low GMT world, okay? But in terms of neorealist vision, okay, it's not the different. Of course, there is an interaction here, but it's where states are located with respect to the power and capabilities that they possess, that you can actually have a picture, a map of the world. Who do you think sits in the middle? That's very, very simple, middle powers. They're called the middle powers. Now, what else can I put in this spectrum? We have the superpowers, we have the weak states, we have the middle powers. Who else do you think we have? UK. Is UK a superpower? Is it a middle power? Well, depends. How would you classify UK? It's a great power. Okay, so what Waltz tell you is this, okay? All states could be placed in this continuum. They all have a specific place in the international spectrum of power. But then, where a state is located in this international spectrum of power, irrespective of the type of a leader it has, or irrespective of the type of a political regime it has, okay, shapes its foreign policy. So, if you're a weak state, how much freedom of choice, not mobility, do you have? Non-existent, okay? Your foreign policy is shaped, especially for the states in this part of the world, or in this part of the spectrum. Your foreign policy is shaped by your position in the international power spectrum, where you don't have any choice, basically. Okay? Poland, during the Cold War years, is a very good example. Okay? Poland became part of the Warsaw Pact in the well, when was the Warsaw Pact established? 1949. So Poland became a member of the Warsaw Pact after NATO is created. Okay, so 1955. Okay, so Poland became, it's in response to NATO. So Poland became a member of Warsaw Pact. Did it choose to become a member of the Warsaw Pact? Did it have any choice? No. What was Poland's foreign policy shaped by? What shaped Polish foreign policy? USSR, exactly. So USSR here is the superpower. Poland is located somewhere here. It's a satellite state under USSR. And during the Cold War years, from 45 to 89, Poland has whether it's a democracy, whether it has X leader versus Y leader, whether it's a non-democracy, has no choice but to follow the Soviet position. Okay? So, or similarly, Nicaragua in the 1970s, 80s, irrespective of the type of a political regime it has, irrespective of the leader it has to follow more or less the American vision, because it's not exactly like Poland, but it's highly dependent on the American presence in Latin America. So what neorealists tell you is this, okay? The most important factor, it doesn't mean all the others don't play a role, but the most important factor that shapes a state's foreign policy is where it's located in this international spectrum of power. Okay? Take Turkey. Okay? Where would you place Turkey? Where is Turkey?
Between great power and little power.
Don't bring in developing. Okay? The realist differentiation does not involve developed world, the less developed world, developing countries, emerging countries. No, that's the globalist paradigm. Okay? That's the labels used by the globalists that you will see at the end of the semester. For the neorealists, you have great powers, you have superpowers, you have middle powers, you have weak states. Okay? So you have something that signals what kind of capabilities they actually possess. Turkey has been classified as a middle power. Okay? And the reason why it's classified as a middle power is very interesting. It's, of course, relates to the type of capabilities it possesses, but it's also middle powers have a specific position that separates them from other types of power, who they ally with or what kind of choices they make in their foreign policy has the possibility to change the distribution of power between the different poles. Okay? So Norway is a middle power. Australia is a middle power. India, Pakistan, Brazil, these are all middle powers. And the middle powers basically have, in a realist paradigm, a specific type of behavior. Okay? They are not unilateral in their foreign policy. What does this mean? They don't follow their own foreign policy at the expense of other countries. Okay? Unilateralism. Do I have the word there? So you can actually differentiate between unilateral behavior versus multilateral. Okay? Middle powers follow multilateral foreign policies. What does this mean? It means, for example, if there is an international crisis, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, okay, or Iraqi weapons of mass destruction acquisition, okay, an international crisis, middle powers would like to build coalitions with other states and try to solve whatever the issue is at through the United Nations. Okay? So they don't act alone. Unilateralism implies acting alone. Okay? Superpowers act unilaterally. Okay? Great powers have a tendency, depending on the type of a power distribution, okay, they have a tendency to act unilaterally, but if they're facing a coalition of other great powers, they wouldn't act unilaterally because then they would find themselves confronting multiple different players. So neorealists, okay, tell you that it's the distribution of power at any given period of time that shapes, influences, determines states' foreign policy. So a neorealist will tell you that Turkish government's decision, okay, to ally with the United States in 1945, okay, is directly understood within the international distribution of power in 1945, okay, between the US and Soviet emerging balance. The Turkish government had to choose a side, okay. It didn't have a choice of standing alone because it was being threatened by the Soviet Union. So Inönü's decision and then the final decision to become part of NATO in 1952, which is now you have Menderes, is not voluntary choices by the Turkish government, but they are choices that were shaped, or actions shaped by the exact position that Turkey had in this international spectrum of power, specifically between the two superpowers. Okay? So neorealists tell you that there is a constant pattern. Buraya tabii biraz şey oluyor. There is a constant pattern between, if this is Turkey, there is a constant pattern of competition over two different players, of course US and USSR in this case, over Turkish allegiance, Turkish participation in either camp, and Turkey finds itself as a pawn in Turkish, as a pawn between these two superpowers. Okay? It's precisely the relative power capabilities that Turkey has in comparison to the US and USSR that shapes its foreign policy, rather than decision making at the Turkish government, or rather than the type of a leader that you have. So the distribution of power at any given period of time, neorealists tell you that bipolarity of the Cold War years. Okay? That's the most important factor shaping individual foreign policies. Okay? So Poland, Turkey, Nicaragua, Chile, US, even the superpowers, act in a certain way, not because of their governmental preferences, not because of their political systems, but because of the position they occupy within that specific international distribution of power. So if you have a bipolar world, that is a bipolar distribution of power, within that bipolarity, there is a certain type of state behavior you would expect to see. You would expect the superpowers from both poles competing over lesser players, Turkey or Poland, doesn't matter. They're competing over lesser players to include them into their own camps. Okay? So bipolarity brings a type of a behavior for both the superpowers and for the lesser powers in terms of allegiance formation. At the same time, neorealists tell you that the type of the balance of power that emerges in the international system would shape the possibility of war. Okay? So certain neorealists will tell you that when there is an equal distribution of power between two poles, war between the two poles would be less likely. Okay? Or some neorealists will tell you, no, that's not the case. You would only have lesser probability of war when there is a preponderant player, when there is a concentration of power in one hand, which is allegiance hegemon. Okay? So certain neorealists will tell you that stability is likelier when there is an hegemonic player. Certain neorealists will tell you that stability is more likely when there is an equal distribution between two different players. But they both camps agree on the same thing, which is the distribution of power is the key. Okay? Not what kind of distribution, but the kind of distribution, but the distribution of power itself. Okay? So what kind of distribution is something that neorealists don't agree, but they all agree on the fact that the most important thing to assess in order to understand foreign policy behavior of states and to understand international politics lies in the distribution of power at any given period of time. So bipolarity brings certain types of international outcomes. Okay? Bipolarity brings certain types of state-to-state interactions. Once those systemic factors change, you would then expect to see a change in the international outcomes as well. Now, what do you think I mean by that? What do you think I mean when in the international structure or the international system changes? Okay, Cold War years, 1945 to 1989. Okay, let's assume you are good old Saddam, and you are in power in Iraq. You have a certain position in the international distribution of power. Okay, you are in the middle power to weak state range. You're not a weak power, but you're somewhere in the middle. Okay, but you're not a middle power either. And you know this. Okay, U.S. and USSR have basically a nuclear deterrent towards one another. They, hold the balance and the key to stability in the international system. And if you plan to do a certain action, fight with Iran, invade Kuwait, you know within the bipolar structure that might bring the US and USSR's response against you. Okay? So bipolarity provides you with what? What does bipolarity provide you with? Bipolarity is the balance of power here. Let me ask you in a different fashion. Alijan, let's assume Alijan wants to kill Jamal. Two players, okay? And he's dying to murder Jamal or attack Jamal at night, but he knows if he acts in that way, what will happen to him? If you attack another person and kill him, what do you know will happen to you? You will be arrested, you will be punished. What is that called? Well, you know the consequences of your actions, therefore you have information, okay? So you know the possible costs of your action. You will be punished if you're caught, okay? What is the possible material benefit of your action? The immediate satisfaction of getting rid of Jamal, tamam? So does the possible cost being in prison exceed the possible material benefit? That's the calculation you make. Sometimes you could say, it's worth it, let me kill him, okay? But the existence of these rules provide you with certain, with information and therefore certainty. Where does this certainty come from? Where does this information come from? Where does this information come from? How do you know you will be punished if you commit a crime? Well, from the government, okay? We have something called a government in Turkey. What does that government do? It provides you with central authority. So what is it that central authority do? Central authority gives you information, okay? It gives you information. It gives you rules, laws. You know what will happen if you pass the red light here out of the campus. You will get a ticket. Where do you get the ticket from? From the central authority, the government. Remove that central authority. How many people will stop at the red light? Okay. Remove that central authority. What would stop Alijan from killing Jamal? Nothing. Okay. Now, apply the same logic to international politics. Do we have a central authority in international politics? No. Are there rules in international politics in the same format as we have rules in domestic politics? No. So, this is precisely the neorealist logic. Anarchy, Waltz say, is your ordering principle. What is anarchy? The absence of central authority. What is it that the central authority do? It provides the agents, the units with information as to the possible consequences of their actions. That action could be killing Jamal. That action could be attacking India, for that matter. Okay? It doesn't really matter. So what central authority does in domestic politics is to provide you with information, certainty, okay, as to what might happen as a result of your actions, okay? What the possible consequences of your actions would be, okay? So it brings you a cost-benefit analysis. Once you remove that central authority, okay, the information is no longer there, and you are now faced with certainty, okay? This is precisely what neorealists tell you that balance of power provides you with. When there is a bipolar distribution of power, when there is US and USSR more or less balancing one another, okay, that acts in a similar fashion that domestic governments act in domestic politics. They provide you with information. So you would know in a bipolar order, if you're Saddam Hussein, what might be the possible consequences of your invading Kuwait would be, exactly like Ali Can knows what might be the possible consequences of killing Jamal would be. So Saddam makes a cost-benefit analysis. Is invading Kuwait worth the possible material costs that I might face as a result of US and USSR balance? Okay? Now, once you remove that balance, once bipolarity ends, okay, 1989, Warsaw Pact dismantles, Soviet Union is in decline, bipolar world order disappears. Now, the certainty of the previous period is gone. Okay? So Saddam sees what? An opportunity, invades Kuwait. Okay? So it's the international system that shapes Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and not Saddam's character. He was the same person in 1980 that he was in 1985. Okay? And it's not the type of a political regime that Iraq has in 1989, which has not changed from 1980 to 1989. What has made the difference that enabled Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 from the neorealist vision is the international structure. Okay? The international structure meaning the bipolar balance of power, which acts exactly like our domestic governments do. They bring certainty into an anarchical world where there are no rules, where there are basically no information as to what might happen if you do what. Okay? So you know in a domestic situation what your possible actions might lead to. In international politics, because we don't have central authority, which is the ordering principle according to Kenneth Waltz, the only information into the system is fed through the balance of power, through the distribution of power. Okay? So you would know during bipolar years, if you're India, what might be the possible consequences of your action be if you, let's say, attack Egypt, okay? Which is an American and British protectorate. Okay? You would know what might happen if you are, let's say, Soviet Union, if you attack Turkey, which is a NATO ally. Okay? So bipolarity in this case, but all distributions of power, all balances bring you with information. If you only have a hegemonic leader, okay, if you have one preponderant leader, let's say the US, you know the rules of the game. You don't contest the US. You would expect certain consequences if you challenge the hegemonic leadership. Okay? So balance of power is the tool in realism that acts in comparison, that acts as if a central authority, okay, that international politics lack. Okay? Good. The theoretical framework that we have provided with the neorealist theory gives you the assessment of state actions. Okay? You can think of your states as units. The state action is a function of the structure. Okay? So we have here, very similar to microeconomics, a structure-agent relationship, where the structure is the international system, and the agents, the units, are the states. And the critical point in neorealism is that the units are not voluntary. They're not voluntary actors. They don't control their own destinies. They don't control their own foreign policy for a specific reason. It's the international structure within which they actually try to survive that shapes both their foreign policy choices and the types of threats, situations, whatever they encounter with. So in contrast, the neo actually is giving you the systemic level. In contrast to classical realism, here we have the importance of the existing international structure and the extent to which it shapes state behavior. Now, what is it that the neorealists mean by the structure? Okay? What is it, what is it that you need to look at in the international structure when you're looking into neorealism? The structure is the international system. Okay? And the most important variable or the most important characteristic of the international system is what? What is the most important characteristic of the international system? How do we characterize international politics? What is it that sets it apart, as we discussed on Tuesday, from, let's say, domestic politics? Naiden. What is the most important element, attribute of international politics?
There's no higher authority.
Exactly. Thank you, Tolga. It's anarchical. Okay? So the most important characteristic of the international system is that it's one of anarchy. Okay? What is anarchy? What does anarchy bring us? It's the absence of a central authority. So anarchy is your ordering principle, but anarchy is not chaos. Okay? We discussed this before. When we talk about anarchy in international politics, we're not talking about the lack of an international any kind of an order. Okay? The only thing we talk about is the absence of, as Tolga said, a higher authority, or more specifically, the absence of central authority. There is no world government. So there is no one institution that has a higher authority than the rest, i.e. the states, that tells the states what the rules of the game are. There are basically no rules. Okay? And that tells the states what, as we discussed again on Tuesday, what the possible consequences of their actions might be if they break these rules. Okay? So the central authority, which brings a level of information in domestic politics with the laws, rules, principles, patterns of behavior, and then also tells us what might happen to the actors, okay, if they break these rules, don't exist at the international level. So according to the neorealists, the most important characteristic, the most important element, which is called for us the ordering principle, is anarchy, the absence of central authority. But then, if there is, no central authority and the international system is characterized by anarchy, then how would the neorealists explain and predict state behavior in their interactions with one another? Okay? Would there be another variable that we could actually look at in the international system that might act similar to what the central authority does in domestic politics? So neorealism tells you, yes, okay, there is another layer that you can actually look at to assess what might impact state behavior, and that's the distribution of power. Okay? So in the absence of central authority, in an anarchical order, neorealists emphasize that the most important variable, the independent variable that you need to look at, is the existing distribution of power at any given period of time to understand the actor's behavior. So what does this mean? Okay? The distribution of power that we look at, which we touched a little on Tuesday, could be different in terms of the number of states. Okay? It could be different in terms of the number of poles. Okay? Not necessarily the exact number of how many states we have, but when you remember our international spectrum of power from Tuesday, where you have concentrations of power and where states are located matters. So in the distribution of power variable, what neorealists tell you is that every international system at any given period of time could be understood by the existing concentration of power in whatever poles, in the exact number of poles. So if you have an international distribution of power where seemingly only one state or a group of states that act together have the largest amount of control over the world's military capabilities, over the world's economic capabilities, over geographical situation, what have you, then you would have a unipolar distribution of power. So the proposition is very clear, right? It's not the exact type of distribution of power that matters, right? It's not what kind of distribution of power that's critical, but it's the fact that you need to look at a distribution of power to understand basically how states act. So the realists, the neorealists, all of them, okay, without a distinction, argue that distribution of power shapes states' behavior. So Poland's foreign policy is the way it is, not because of Polish government or leader, but because of the exact location that Poland has in the international distribution of power. Similarly, you want to understand American foreign policy? American foreign policy could only be understood with respect to where the US is located in the larger distribution of power. So all neorealists basically agree, okay, among themselves that in the absence of central authority, the anarchical order, the key to understand international politics, foreign policy behavior of individual states lies specifically in the exact type of distribution of power that exists at any given period of time, okay? But, there is a but, there is always a but, okay? The neorealists don't agree, okay, among themselves in terms of exactly what kind of distribution of power is critical for international stability. So there is a scholarly debate between the neorealists who would argue that, right, certain types of distribution are more likely to eliminate the probability of war, okay? Therefore lead to international stability. So neorealists don't argue among themselves, okay, that a neorealist, Mearsheimer, talking together with another neorealist, let's say Gilpin here, okay, they would not argue among themselves whether it's the distribution of power that matters, okay? They wouldn't have a contestation there. Both would say, yes, my friend, you are totally right, okay? In the absence of a central authority, what shapes American behavior, Turkish behavior, French behavior, what have you, is the distribution of power. But then they will contest one another, they will argue over exactly what kind of distribution of power is critical, okay? So one of them will say, if you want to, for example, if you want to understand the likelihood of war, one of them will say, equal distribution of power, okay? Equal distribution of power between the number of poles, okay? Bipolarity is more or less an equal distribution of power between two different poles, okay? One of them will say, when you have an equal distribution of power, let's say between two different players, likelihood of war between them will decrease, okay? That's what? What is this? It's a proposition, okay? This is a proposition. So one of them will say, equal distribution of power between two players, okay, will decrease the likelihood of war among them. This is a balance of power theorist. Okay? Another one will say, both neorealist, no. It will say, or he will say, preponderance of power, okay? That is, when you have power concentrated in one hand, preponderance of power will decrease the likelihood of war. These are both equally valid propositions coming from the neorealists, okay? What is the common point between them? What would be the common point between them? You are trying to understand whether there might be a war between, let's say, Iran versus United States in the near future, okay? What is the common point between the neorealists to assess the likelihood of war between US and Iran? What is it that they would agree on?
State-side question.
those are all the assumptions that we already know. So states are rational, states are unitary, the most important interest is national security. These are already the assumptions we are, totally in control of. Okay? What would be, based on these assumptions, they would agree on these. So Tolga is right. They would share similar assumptions. Okay? But based on these similar assumptions, what would be the neo-realists, irrespective of what kind of distribution of power they look at, what would be the main thing that they would agree on? What would be the most important thing they would agree on? Let's start with that. If I bring a neo-realist into this class, right, which I actually, I mostly use neo-realism in my work, and a constructivist, let's say, okay, which is a bit advanced for you now, but what would be neo-realists, what would the neo-realist be actually saying that might be different than a constructivist? Okay, exactly. But the first thing they would agree on is this. They would say the world is defined as one of anarchy. Okay? So in an anarchical world, so they would basically say the world is characterized. The main differentiating element, that's why we called it the ordering principle. The main differentiating element of international politics is that it's anarchy, which means then there is nothing, okay, from the most powerful, from the superpower, to the least powerful, from United States to Ethiopia. Okay? There is nothing in the international political system that would actually protect these states from other states. Okay? There would be nothing in the international system that would have some kind of rules inserted into the system and some kind of an institution, a government-like institution. Okay? The UN might be, but it's of course not the case. Some kind of institution that would enforce these rules and give the information to the system that if one of the players, the US or Ethiopia, doesn't really matter, from the most powerful to the least powerful, let's say, if one of the players break the rules, what might happen? So the anarchical ordering principle means, okay, you don't have a higher authority, a central institution that would be able to pass laws, make rules, enforce these. In the absence of this, what do states rely on? What is it that states have to rely on to promote their key interests, national security, power? Okay? So neo-realists agree on anarchy. Okay? They agree on anarchy as being the starting point. Okay? The reason I mentioned the constructivist, if a constructivist comes into this classroom, the constructivist will tell you that anarchy is not constant, and anarchy is actually not something given, as neo-realists tell you, but anarchy is also something constructed by the states themselves. So if the states construct anarchy, they can get rid of anarchy. If it's something you build, you can unbuild it. Whereas from the neo-realist perspective, anarchy is not something that states have created. Anarchy is given. Okay? It's already there. It's not constructed. It's already something that's an attribute of international politics. Therefore, if it is not built by the states, it cannot be unbuilt by the states. It's there. It's a given factor. So neo-realists will tell you that anarchy is given, and they wouldn't contest that. Then we come to Ali Can's point. The second thing that the neo-realists will tell you, or for that matter, more or less, all realists, okay, since power is the most critical variable or most critical element that all states have to rely on to promote their own interests. And what is the most important interest? Survival. Okay? And there is nothing else in the system that would protect them. We talked about alliances on Tuesday. Alliances have a lifespan. Okay? So alliances emerge if there is actually a common interest between different players. So NATO is there as long as there is a common threat, as long as there is a Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapses, we actually then ask, what is NATO for? And you cannot rely on the permanency of an alliance. Alliances are temporary. They come, they go. Okay? They're not permanent. So even when you have an alliance, you cannot still be 100% sure that others will come to your help in case of an external attack as well. So the neo-realists tell you that it's an uncertain world. What is uncertainty coming from? Lack of rules. Okay? Why do we have lack of rules? We don't have a central authority. Okay? Where is uncertainty coming from? You don't know other players' intentions. Okay? Turkey does not know 100% what Syria intends to do. Okay? So uncertainty comes about from other players' intentions, and you also have uncertainty about other players' capabilities. Okay? We don't know what Russia is capable of exactly. We don't know 100% what the military capabilities of India, Pakistan are. Neither India nor Pakistan knows what each other's capabilities are. They don't know exactly 100% what they intend to do. So there is uncertainty about rules. There is there is no rules basically. There are no rules. There is uncertainty about other players' intentions, capabilities. So what you then see is individual actors, in order to promote their own survival, i.e. their key national self-interest, they have to rely on their own power. Okay? They have to rely on these crude capabilities that they could build on. But since no one player can have in control of the world's main capabilities, what have you, okay, you would actually see an emergence of alliances. That's a variable in the distribution of power. And you would see basically how power is concentrated in a number of different hands. So neorealists agree on anarchy. They agree on uncertainty. They agree on the impact of uncertainty on states' actions. And they agree on that the only tool, okay, that states have to rely on is their power. They also agree on another thing. Okay? It is that structure shapes unit behavior. So when I say they agree on anarchy, this is precisely what I mean. They agree that it's the international structure, elements in the international system, rather than unit level attributes, okay? Rather than states' attributes, individual leader, political system, what have you, rather than the state's attributes, it's the international system that shapes state behavior. So they basically say, in the absence of a central authority, given the fact that states are all individual actors trying to maximize their interests and guarantee their survival, okay, they use the key element of power to basically realize this. Okay? But every international structure within itself also has specific types of concentration of power or distribution of power, which in return shapes what states do. So the neorealists don't agree on one thing. Okay? They agree on all of these 1, 2, 3, 4 that we listed, but they don't agree on the exact formulation of the distribution of power. Okay? So their main disagreement is this. Okay? They would actually argue, a group of neorealists will tell you that, okay, states will have more information about intentions, capabilities, the probable consequences of their actions when there is an equal distribution of power between players. That equal distribution of power could be between two poles. Okay? So John Mearsheimer here, he's very straightforward. As a neorealist, he says, when you have an equal distribution of power between two big players, okay, USA, USSR, the Cold War years, okay, it's a bipolar order. When we have a bipolar order, the likelihood of war that would actually encompass the whole world. You could have a war between Uruguay and Paraguay. That's perfectly fine. It wouldn't involve the whole world. The likelihood of war between the major players will decrease. Okay? So Mearsheimer, okay, believes that equal distribution of power between two different players, USA and USSR, is the most conducive, is the most likely balance that would increase international stability. Okay? What is international stability? When you have the absence of major wars between great powers. So Napoleonic Wars, 1790 through 1815, is when you don't have international stability. Okay? World War I, World War II, we don't have international stability. So for Mearsheimer, the key to international stability lies in the equal distribution of power between, let's say, two players. And there is actually a reason for this, okay? And the reason is this. Remember, we said anarchy leads to uncertainty, and uncertainty is dealt with the balance of power. Uncertainty increases as the number of players increase, okay? So the more actors you have, okay, the more great powers we have, let's say. Okay? Today we're talking about a multipolar world. The higher the number of actors, the higher the level of uncertainty. Precisely. The higher the level of actors, the higher the level of uncertainty. So certain neorealists basically tell you this. Okay? The higher, the more number of, great powers specifically, not the weak states. The higher the number of great powers, the higher the level of uncertainty, and the higher the probability of miscalculation. Okay? So if you're United States trying to assess the behavior of India, Pakistan, China, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Japan, what have you, instead of only trying to calculate what USSR is doing, as you did during the Cold War years, the possibility of miscalculation is higher because you're trying to assess the actions of a higher number of countries when you're facing a larger number. Okay? So during the Cold War years, US and USSR were basically looking at each other and trying to assess the intentions and capabilities of each other, one actor. Today, okay, since there is no longer a bipolar balance of power, the USA is trying to assess, or Turkey for that matter, it doesn't really matter which state you're looking at, you're trying to assess the intentions, capabilities of a higher number of players. So the potential for miscalculation increases when you have higher number of actors, okay, according to certain neorealists, okay, because not all neorealists agree with that either. So the ones who are saying equal distribution of power between two players, okay, balance of power between two different players, bipolarity, Morton Kaplan is a good illustration of that, is when you have the highest tendency to have international stability with a lower probability of great power wars, okay? Or in general, likelihood of war decreases because, as we have seen on Tuesday in the example of Saddam's invasion of Iraq, even though Saddam might have wanted to get Kuwait, not Iraq, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, even though Saddam probably wanted to invade Kuwait before, okay, he didn't because of the equal distribution of power between the US and USSR, which brought him a certain level of knowledge as to what might happen if he invaded Kuwait. Okay? The minute that information source, bipolarity disappears, okay, Saddam has the potential now to miscalculate. Okay? He miscalculates the potential consequences of his action, the invasion of Kuwait, as a result of the disappearance of bipolar world. Now, on the other hand, remember we're trying to assess the difference between them. On the other hand, a group of neorealists will tell you, no, equality is not a good thing. Okay? When you have an equal distribution of power, that's not necessarily the key to international stability or lower likelihood of war, because equal distribution of power implies one or the other player, in case of a military confrontation, might actually win that military confrontation. So when you have an equality or something that resembles an equality, likelihood of war would actually increase. Okay? So neorealist A versus neorealist B, even though they would agree on anarchy, distribution of power, what have you, they disagree on the exact distribution of power. Okay? So the second group will tell you, in order to have international stability, you need to have a preponderance of power. Now, what is preponderance of power? You need to have one player who has the potential to control the actions of all others. Okay? How would that one actor have the potential to control the others' actions? that actor would have higher military capabilities compared to the others. It would have, let's say, certain things that the others don't have. Okay, perfect illustration, nuclear capability. Okay, if one player has, as we had in 1945 to 1957 period, if only one country in the world has nuclear powers, and in this time period from 45 to 57, it was only the US that had nuclear capabilities. How do we know this?
Because she demonstrated it.
Well, exactly. The United States bombed Japan in 1945, so we know precisely because the A bomb was used, USA has nuclear capabilities. Why am I saying from 1945 to 1957?
Because the USSR.
Exactly. We have talked about this before. So in 1957, the Soviet Union had the first experiment with Sputnik. They sent a missile to outer space. So they demonstrated that they also have nuclear capability. So from 45 to 57, it was only the US that had demonstrated, and we knew, therefore, 100% that they had nuclear capabilities. We wouldn't know, for example, in the case of India and Pakistan, we wouldn't know whether Pakistan had a nuclear capability or not until the point that they actually tested that. Okay? Where do you think India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapons? Near the border, but where? Underground, very close to the Earth's magma. So they did their tests not in the outer space, they did their tests underground, okay? Now, so preponderance of power. What do we mean by preponderance of power then is one state is able to control the military capabilities, economic capabilities, has a large population, therefore it's able to also possess certain types of tangible capabilities. Now, the existence of a preponderant power is called actually an hegemon. Okay? So we have under neorealism a specific theory, okay, which ties what we have just discussed to state behavior. Theory of hegemonic stability. The theory of hegemonic stability tells you that when you have an hegemon, i.e. a preponderant power, okay, i.e. a power that's able to control military and economic capabilities in the world much better than other players, and it cannot be brought down even by a coalition of other players, okay, then you have the highest potential for international stability. Okay? If you have an hegemon, that hegemon will create international institutions. Okay? So if we are talking about United States in 1940s, the hegemonic leadership of United States will be the main factor behind the formation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Okay? It will be the main factor behind the formation of the World Bank. Okay? It will be the main factor behind the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs, Trade and Tariffs, the GATT agreement signed in 1949, which is the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, WTO, trade liberalization. Okay? The presence of the US as an hegemonic leader in the 40s again becomes a critical factor behind the formation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we didn't discuss yet. It will be the main factor behind the formation of biological and chemical weapons conventions. So when you have an hegemonic leader, that hegemonic leader acts exactly like what? IMF, World Bank, the WTO, the NPT treaty, the NATO alliance is another illustration. It actually brings in rules. Okay? The hegemon creates rules. Okay? The hegemon says, well, if you don't have nuclear weapons in 1968, you cannot build nuclear weapons. And the rest of the countries say, yes, we agree with that. Okay? So you have the emergence of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay? So what does an hegemon then act very similar to, according to the theory of hegemonic stability? If you bring rules, tamam, and when the rules are broken, if the hegemon has the capacity to punish, okay? Exactly. It acts as if it's a central authority. Okay? So the hegemon, okay, the preponderant power that emerges in the international politics because one power is, or one country is able to control most of the world's capabilities, it acts exactly like a central authority. So theory of hegemonic stability. Okay? Theory of hegemonic stability tells you that in the absence of central authority, in the absence of a world government, the one thing that comes closest to that is the presence of an hegemon. Okay? So an hegemon, or emergence of an hegemonic leader, becomes critical in the creation of international rules. Okay? And the hegemon at any given period of time is always the most powerful state at that given period of time, but not all powerful states are hegemons, okay? You need to actually see, if you are trying to understand what an hegemonic leader is, you also need to check for the fact that if there might form a coalition of other players who would among themselves have first the intention to bring the hegemon down, or to balance the hegemon by a convergence of their own capabilities, by a congregation of their own capabilities. So for theory of hegemonic stability under neorealism, 19th century, okay? The 19th century, for example, is characterized by the British hegemony. It's Pax Britannica. We even have words for that, Pax Britannica. It's the century of United Kingdom. So in the British hegemony, what is it that, well, what do you think enabled Britain or United Kingdom to have more relative power compared to the other states? Huh? Okay, naval power. It has the largest and the only standing naval power in the 19th century. The Spanish Navy disappeared in 1688. The French Navy disappeared, I told you this before, in the Battle of Agadir during Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. So that left the British Navy as the only major navy in the world. So naval power, its ability to control large sections of the globe. Okay? It's the, empire that the sun never sets. Okay? Exactly, because wherever you go to, in whichever part of the Commonwealth, there would be sun. So they would control India, Pakistan, Egypt, Australia, New Zealand, Australia, United States. The last war between UK and United States was in 1812. United Kingdom actually invaded certain parts of United States, and they even burned the White House before it became the White House of today's White House. Okay, so the then White House of 1812 was burned down. So Britain was the most powerful state, partly because it had the naval power, but also because, if you look at, again, this is a very important factor in neorealism, the economic capabilities. Okay? It's not only the military capabilities that matter, but it's the economic capabilities. So what is it that the UK possessed? It was, again, the country that had the highest gross domestic product. Okay? It's where industrial revolution has begun, okay? 1801. So economic and military capabilities enabled Britain to insert certain rules. What did Britain want in the 19th century? Britain said, we want to have free trade, okay? Because free trade benefits the Brits. They said, well, we want to have certain rules in the international system. The economic capabilities also enabled the United Kingdom to control the financial affairs of the world through the pound. So when you look at this, would be a very good way to assess, for example, the relative power of states. Okay? In the 19th century, the gold standard was set to the pound. So the gold standard is used to assess the country's currencies. Gold standard means that for every currency, pound in this case, if pound is linked to the gold, for every pound that you print, there is a gold backing it up in whatever, the British banks. So pound was the currency to which gold was linked to. After World War II, that changed to the US dollar with the Bretton Woods system. Okay? So after World War II, we actually see Pax Britannica decline and Pax Americana coming. Okay? Now, today, do we have the gold standard? Is there any currency? No. Okay? We don't. The American gold standard is gone in 1971. So if you want to see whichever country is close to an hegemonic leadership, or which happens to be the preponderant power at any given period of time, the financial and economic distribution is an important factor. Tolga, you were saying something.
I don't know how important it is. I went to the lecture of Mearsheimer in Koç University. I remember that he was saying to be a global hegemony for a country, you gotta have a regional hegemony. And he asserted that Britain. I know. That was John's point. I know. So that's precisely his argument. He says United Kingdom was never a hegemon. Yeah. So it's a contestation of the argument I just put together. When you read Gilpin, okay, or Organski, you will actually see them talking about UK being the global hegemon precisely because it has naval power, precisely because it had the economic and pound capabilities. Mearsheimer says UK could never be the hegemonic power in the world, even in the 19th century, because it's a small island, and it never actually controlled very large land masses in Europe, okay, but outside of Europe, okay? So that was his point. Yes, he doesn't agree with that, okay?
The division of Latin America, the treaty brokered between the Spanish and the Portuguese was done by the British, by the UK. They even had regional power because
yes,
this was a European.
Very good. This is a very good illustration of the disagreements that exists between different theoreticians over how to define an hegemon and how to define international stability. I think it's a very good illustration of that. Okay? But a lot of people don't agree, and we are recording this with John's classification that UK was not an hegemonic leader. Okay? So we have then, okay, irrespective of what we define, we have then in the theory of hegemonic stability, and this is critical, the argument that in order to have any kind of stability in the international system, you need to have an hegemon. Okay? You need to have a preponderant power. Why do you need that preponderant power? Because there is no central authority, so the hegemon places the rules. It tells other players what to do. As Jamal have said, Spain and Portugal can't agree on the sharing of Latin America. The hegemon steps in, says, you get this, you get that, what have you, facilitates the negotiations, and they would listen to the hegemon because the hegemon has the capacity to punish them. Okay? So the reason why people or other states follow the hegemon's rule is very straightforward. The hegemon impacts their material costs and benefits. If you are, for example, France in 1949, and you see the emergence of a general agreement on trade and tariff, okay, free trade for all, sort of a logic, and you say, well, I'm not so sure if I want to be a part of this free trade, okay? But being excluded from the free trade agreement for a country such as France comes with significant material costs. Okay? So the presence of an agreement, okay, through the hegemonic rule changes the material costs and benefits for other players. So once an hegemon says, MPT, for example, GATT, all of these are agreements that are pushed together, pushed out by the hegemon. Okay? When you break the rules, you know what might happen. Okay? Iran knows when it builds nuclear weapons, despite the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, what the possible consequences of its actions would be because of the existing rules that were put together by an hegemon. Okay? So the presence of an hegemon impacts the rational material calculations of the individual states. The costs of not following the hegemon's rule would be too high. Okay? So the theory of hegemonic stability then says you would have an hegemon at any given period of time. If you have an hegemon, therefore it's not always constant. If you have an hegemon, then that hegemon would actually manage. Okay? It would enable other states to handle the effects of what? What would you manage if you have an hegemon? Meltem Hanım talks. Anarchy.
Okay? You would be able to manage anarchy. You cannot eliminate anarchy, it's given, but you would be able to manage the effects of anarchy through a hegemon. But then hegemons are not, permanent. They come, they go. Okay? UK went, United States declined, so hegemons go. So the theory of hegemonic stability then gives you a prescription. Okay? What might happen? Prescription, a possible consequence. What might happen when the hegemon declines? Okay? So theory of hegemonic stability again tells you that when you see a decline in the power of an hegemon, the likelihood of war will increase. Okay? 19th century, British power began to decline towards the end of the 19th century, and we see the rise of a challenger. Okay? That takes you to the power transition theory. We see the rise of contestation coming from Germany. Okay? Germany begins to build a similar navy to United Kingdom. Germany is unhappy with certain conditions of the rules that are put together and enforced by the United Kingdom. So what you see then is the hegemon declines in power relative to the power of other states. UK begins to decline relative to the rise of Germany's increase. So as hegemon declines, stability becomes problematic because likelihood of war increases. So theory of hegemonic stability, you would have a lower probability of war when you have an hegemon in place, and the probability of war will increase when the hegemon declines. Okay? World War I, theory of hegemonic stability tells you is an end result of the decline in the hegemon. Okay? Today, you can think of, for example, if you want to see today's world, okay, we're talking about the decline in hegemony of not only the United States, but the USA and EU or European countries together, which were the camp, let's say, or the pole in the bipolar world since 1945. Okay? In 1990, for example, the combined share of United States and EU countries in global welfare, in global GDP, was about 52%. So more than half, okay, more than half of the world's GDP, that is the world's wealth, that's the GDP. More than half of the world's wealth was in the hands of the Americans and the Europeans in 1990. In 2011, that's down to 38%. Okay? So there is a decline. Okay? And the rise of the share of the global wealth among the newly rising countries, China, India, Brazil, what else? Russia, what else? These are the BRICS, by the way. Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRICS. Turkey, Mexico, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and these are the mists. There are names for these çocuklar. BRICS. Well, we sometimes put South Africa here and mists. Two different names, okay? Total of how many countries? 9, okay? The rise of the share of the global wealth by the BRICS and the mists are challenging the American and European share today, okay? But from theory of hegemonic stability's point of view, okay? Life is very straightforward. If you're an hegemon, if you have an hegemon, you have rules in the system, and the hegemon has the capacity to punish those who default, okay? When the hegemon declines, the rules began to be openly violated. So when the hegemon declines, Iran begins to acquire nuclear weapons. Okay? When the hegemon declines, the probability of punishing the ones who are defaulting from the existing rules decrease. Okay? So theory of hegemonic stability tells you that rules are in place, enforceable, when you have an hegemon that acts like a central authority. But then that's not constant. Okay? Hegemons come, hegemons go. Okay? Now, this is precisely the point made, and therefore, both of theory of hegemonic stability and power transition theory is in the second proposition line, where you see the presence of preponderant power as the key. Power transition theory is very similar in that sense to the arguments made in the theory of hegemonic stability. Power transition theory says that you have cycles of power, okay? Power cycles where one state or groups of states could control the world's wealth, military capabilities, what have you, but they are cyclical. They come and they go. And as you have the emergence of challengers in power transition theory, challengers to the existing status quo, likelihood of war will increase. So power transition theory tells you that war will become more likely and the international system will become less stable when a challenger to the hegemonic stability, to the hegemonic leader, begins to emerge. Okay? So World War II, World War I, both wars are explained by power transition theory to the, in line with the rise in Germany's power compared to or tied to Germany's unhappiness, non-satisfaction. That's the key word. Non-satisfaction with the existing rules, the existing status quo. So power transition theory is a bit different than theory of hegemonic stability in that way, where power transition theory, Organsky and Modelsky, they emphasize that for a challenger, okay, to become more likely to use force, that challenger has to be dissatisfied with the status quo. Iran currently is dissatisfied with the status quo. What is the source of Iranian dissatisfaction? The Iranian government wants to have nuclear weapons. The NPT, the existing rules put together by hegemonic leadership of US and EU, stops that. Okay? So Iran challenges that. Okay? But if Iran acquires significant, that's how you would also explain the impossibility or the lower probability of war. If Iran acquires significant capabilities that could correspond or balance the US capabilities, then war will be more likely. So power transition theory tells you that your challenger, okay, you have a challenger, the challenger has to acquire more or less equal distribution of power compared to the defender of the status quo for war to be likely. Okay? So as long as the power equilibrium between US and Iran is like this, war will not happen irrespective of how much Iran is dissatisfied. Okay? But as Iranian power comes close to the American power, then war will be more likely. So preponderance of power then, power transition theory of hegemonic stability sees the likelihood of war when you have this equality of distribution, in contrast to balance of power theorists who argue that, no, as long as you have an equality of power, war will not happen. Okay? So they contest one another. The neorealists, there is an ongoing scholarly debate within the neorealists as well in terms of what kind of distribution of power is more conducive to international stability and which would make war less likely. Power transition, theory of hegemonic stability looks at distribution of power in this way and sees war becoming more likely as the challenger increases in power. Equal distribution of power looks at this equality of distribution and sees war becoming more likely when one of the players increase in power. Okay? So there is actually a disagreement over the impact of the exact distribution of power, but they don't disagree over the fact that it is the distribution of power that matters and nothing else.